In the grand echoing lobby of the Hotel Sterling, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Sunlight, thick and golden, poured through the tall, arched windows, catching the swirls of dust motes and making the polished marble floors gleam like a frozen river. The scent was a careful composition of expensive floral perfume, the rich aroma of brewing coffee from the corner cafe, and the faint, clean smell of beeswax used on the dark wood paneling. It was a space designed to impress, to whisper of old money and quiet luxury. And at its center, like a king on a throne of black lacquer and gleaming gold, sat the concert grand piano. Seated on the padded bench was the man who had tamed it. His name was Elias Thorne, and at 60 years old, his face was a map of a life spent in pursuit of perfection. His hair, once dark, was now a distinguished silver, swept back from a high forehead. His suit was a deep charcoal, tailored so perfectly it seemed part of him. And his posture was ramrod straight, a discipline ingrained over decades. His hands, though now still for a moment, were the true spectacle. Long, elegant fingers, with prominent knuckles and neatly trimmed nails, they rested on the keys as if they belonged there, as if they had been born for no other purpose. He began to play. The piece was Chopin, an etude so famously difficult it was considered a benchmark for any pianist. To the small crowd gathered in a respectful semicircle, the sound was nothing short of miraculous. It was a cascade of crystal beads, a waterfall of glass notes tumbling over one another with impossible speed and clarity. His fingers flew across the ivory, a blur of motion, a dance of such precision it seemed mechanical. Each note was a perfect, polished gem, placed exactly where it should be, struck with just the right amount of force to sing out clearly before melting into the next. There was no hesitation, no fumble, no hint of the immense physical and mental effort required. It was, by all accounts, flawless performance. But inside the carefully constructed fortress of Ilias's mind, there was no music. There was only a process. As his right hand navigated the dizzying runs of 16th notes, a part of his brain was calmly ticking off a checklist. F-sharp minor. 4/4 time. Presto. Watch the articulation in the left hand. Don't let it become muddy. Remember the diminuendo in bar 32? The critics always look for that. He wasn't feeling the storm of passion the music was supposed to convey. He was executing a complex mathematical equation. His fingers, which had been trained since he was a boy shorter than the piano keyboard, moved with a life of their own, guided by a lifetime of muscle memory. He was a pilot flying a plane on autopilot through a familiar storm. Aware of the turbulence, but feeling none of it, he let his gaze drift for a fraction of a second, taking in the audience. He saw a businessman in a crisp suit glancing at his expensive watch, clearly late for a meeting. He saw a young couple, the woman whispering something in the man's ear, both of them more absorbed in each other than in the masterpiece being crafted just feet away. He saw an elderly woman, her eyes closed, a gentle smile on her face, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of something, a ghost of a connection. But then her eyes opened, and she fumbled in her purse for her phone, aiming its camera at him. The flash, thankfully, was off. They weren't there for the music. They were there to capture the idea of the music, to have a souvenir of the famous Elias Thorne playing in a fancy hotel. They were a backdrop, a necessary component of the job, like the piano itself or the printed program. He was a product, and they were the consumers. His mind wandered further, away from the echoing lobby and onto a checklist of mundane worries. He needed to remember to call his agent about the tour dates in the spring. There was that annoying hum in the C-sharp just above middle C that the hotel technician had failed to fix. He wondered if the flight to Vienna would be delayed again. He thought about the review in the Times last week, the one that praised his technical brilliance, but called his interpretation lacking in visceral heat. The critic had used the word antiseptic. It had stung. Not because it was unfair, but because it was true. The music swelled towards its dramatic climax, a torrent of sound that should have been filled with anguish and fury. Ilias's hands hammered the keys, his body swaying slightly with the force. a performance of passion that was utterly convincing from the outside. On the inside, he was thinking about what he would have for dinner. The room service steak was usually reliable, but a bit overpriced. Perhaps he could slip out to that little bistro around the corner, the one with the good onion soup. The thought was a small, quiet rebellion against the perfection he was chained to. The final chords crashed through the lobby, a series of powerful, resonant statements that hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. The silence was broken almost immediately by a wave of polite applause. It was the sound of obligation, a soft, pattering rain that was as expected as the sunrise. Elias stood and gave a slight formal bow. His face was a mask of humble gratitude, a practiced expression that he could summon on demand. He felt no joy, no sense of accomplishment. He felt only the profound emptiness that always followed a performance, a hollow ache where a thrill was supposed to be. He sat back down, placing his fingers on the keys for the next piece. The polished wood of the piano felt cool and impersonal under his touch. It was a beautiful machine, a masterpiece of engineering, but to him now, it was just that, a machine. He had once loved it. He remembered being a boy, small enough that his feet couldn't reach the pedals, getting lost in the worlds the music created. He remembered feeling the notes deep in his bones, a direct line from his heart to his fingertips. But that felt like a story someone had told him about another person a lifetime ago. Now, the music was a cage, and his mastery was the lock. He looked out at the faces, waiting for him to begin again, and felt more alone than ever in the middle of the crowded, opulent room. With a quiet, almost inaudible sigh, he began to play the next piece, another perfect, flawless, and utterly heartless set of notes. The polite, pattering rain of applause died down, and the lobby of the Hotel Sterling settled back into a state of quiet expectation. The man at the piano, Elias, gave another small, almost invisible bow. He felt no connection to the sound of their clapping. It was just noise, a signal that the first task was complete and the next one was about to begin. He placed his long, pale fingers back on the ivory keys, and the room grew even quieter. This time, he would play a sonata, a piece that was meant to be full of deep sadness and longing. It was a famous piece, one that could make people weep, if it was played with true feeling. As Elias began to play, the music that filled the grand lobby was indeed sad. It was like a slow, gray river flowing through a landscape of bare trees. The notes were heavy with a sorrow that was supposed to touch the heart. But for the man playing them, there was no heart involved. He was simply going through the motions. His fingers knew the path. They pressed the keys with the correct pressure, held the notes for the precise length of time, and moved from one chord to the next with a smooth, practiced grace. To anyone listening, it was the sound of a master sharing his soul. But inside his head, Elias was thinking about the dry cleaning he needed to pick up. He was a perfect machine producing the illusion of emotion, but there was one person in the room who was not fooled. Tucked away behind a large potted fern whose green fronds drooped like tired feathers, sat a little boy. He was maybe 7 years old, with scuffed sneakers and a t-shirt that had a faded cartoon dinosaur on it. He had been holding his mother's hand, but she had gotten distracted by the long line at the front desk. The check-in process was a confusing world of credit cards and passports for her, and the boy, feeling his hand grow sweaty in hers, had quietly slipped away. He had not meant to wander off, but then he had heard the sound. It was like a net, catching him and pulling him towards the center of the room. He had found a spot on the cool marble floor, hidden by the fern, and he had sat down, cross-legged, to listen, while everyone else in the lobby watched the man's hands flying across the keys. The little boy was watching something else entirely. The lid of the grand piano was propped open, and from his low angle, he could see inside. He could see the hammers, covered in soft felt, dancing up and down. He could see the tight, shiny strings vibrating, shimmering like heat waves on a summer road. To him, that was where the real magic was. The man on the bench was just the operator, but the piano itself was alive. It was a beautiful, mysterious creature singing a sad song. The slow, heavy notes of the sonata washed over him. He didn't know the name of the piece, or who had written it, He didn't know it was supposed to be sad. He just felt it. It felt like the time he had fallen and scraped his knee, and his mother had been too busy on the phone to notice right away. It was a lonely feeling, a small ache in his chest. He cocked his head to one side, his brow furrowed in concentration. As if trying to understand a secret language, the piano was speaking just to him. His bottom lip had gone slightly slack. He had forgotten all about the toy car in his pocket and the promise of a cookie from the hotel bakery. His whole world had shrunk to this small, dark space behind the fern and the sound of the lonely. Singing piano around him, the adults were a different kind of audience. A businessman in a stiff suit shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at his watch. The young couple from before were now whispering and laughing softly at a video on the man's phone. An elderly lady dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but it felt like something she was supposed to do, like she was following a script. They were all watching a performance. The little boy was listening to a feeling. He was so still, so completely absorbed in the music, that he seemed to be a part of the furniture, a small, silent statue hidden in the green shadows of the fern. Ilya's eyes, as they often did during a performance, scanned the crowd without really seeing them. It was a habit, a way to make it look like he was connecting with his audience while his mind was miles away. His gaze swept past the businessman, the young couple, the elderly lady. It was all just a blur of faces, a collection of polite but uninterested strangers. Then, for a brief moment, his eyes landed on the small figure behind the fern. He saw a little boy sitting on the floor, staring intently at his piano. A flicker of annoyance crossed his mind. Great, a child. He hoped he wouldn't start crying or make a noise. He didn't have the energy for a disruption. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came and looked away, focusing his blank stare on a painting of a sailboat on the far wall. He played the final, mournful chords of the sonata, his fingers striking the keys with a perfect, hollow sadness. The last note faded into silence. The lobby held its breath for a second, and then, as expected, the polite applause began again. It was a little softer this time, more respectful of the sad music they had just heard. People began to shift and move, the spell broken. The businessman checked his phone again. The young couple put theirs away. But the little boy did not move. He did not clap. For him, the music was not over. He could still feel it vibrating in the air, in the floor, inside his own small chest. Clapping would have been like shouting while someone was still talking. It would have been rude. He just sat there, his wide eyes fixed on the silent, sleeping strings inside the piano, waiting to see if it had anything more to say. The last mournful note of the sonata hung in the air like a ghost, and for a moment, the grand lobby of the Hotel Sterling was truly silent. It was a heavy, thoughtful silence, the kind that follows a story that has touched a nerve, even if only for a second. Then, the spell was broken. A few people coughed. Someone's phone buzzed with a notification. The polite, pattering applause started, a little quieter this time, a little more respectful. It was the sound of people appreciating art, the way they are supposed to. The man at the piano, Elias, let his hands rest on the keys. His fingers still curved as if holding the final chord. He gave a slight nod, his face a mask of solemn gratitude. He felt nothing. The sadness of the music had been a costume he had put on, and now he was ready to take it off. He had one more piece to play, a lively and technically demanding showpiece that would end his set on a high note. A burst of energy that would make people forget the melancholy and leave them feeling impressed. It was the perfect way to end. Efficient, professional. He reached for his glass of water on a small table next to the piano. His movements slow and deliberate. He was just going through the motions, a worker on an assembly line. The next product was about to be rolled out. But as he placed the glass back down, a small movement caught his eye. It was the little boy from behind the fern. He was standing up now, his small body unfolding from the floor. His mother, who had finally finished at the front desk and was looking around with a hint of panic, spotted him at the same moment. Her face flushed a bright red. She hurried towards him, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, sound of urgency and embarrassment. "Sam, honey, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice a frantic hiss as she reached for his hand. "You can't just run off like that." But the boy, Sam, pulled his hand away. His eyes were fixed on the piano. He had not clapped after the last piece, and he wasn't interested in leaving now. The music had stopped, but the feeling it left behind was still buzzing inside him. He took a step closer, drawn by an invisible force. His mother tried again, her voice a little louder this time, a desperate plea. "Sam, come on. We have to go to our room." The boy ignored her. He walked with a strange purpose, his scuffed sneakers making soft, squeaking sounds on the polished floor. He walked right past the semicircle of chairs where the audience had been sitting, heading straight for the grand piano. A few people watched him with amused smiles. "Oh, how cute. A little boy wants to see the piano up close." Others, like the businessman, looked annoyed, their impatience for the next piece clearly written on their faces. Elias saw the boy approaching, and a familiar flicker of irritation sparked inside him. A disruption. Just what he needed. He was paid to play music, not to babysit. The boy stopped right beside the piano bench. He was so small that the top of the head barely reached the keyboard. He craned his neck, looking up at the man seated there, his eyes wide and full of a question that had not yet been spoken. His mother was right behind him, her face a picture of horror. "I am so sorry," she said to Elias, her voice trembling with embarrassment. "He's never like this. I don't know what's gotten into him." "Sam, we're leaving right now." She grabbed for his arm, this time with a firmer grip, but it was too late. The boy had already spoken. His voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the low murmur of the lobby like a small, sharp knife. He looked directly at the famous pianist, his expression one of pure, innocent earnestness, and asked the simple, world-stopping question. "Excuse me, sir? May I try?" A few people in the small crowd chuckled. The mother looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," she repeated, tugging at her son's arm. "He's just a little boy. He doesn't understand." Elias looked down at the boy. He was ready to give the standard polite dismissal. "I'm sorry, little man. This piano is not for playing." It was a line he had used 100 times. But something in the boy's eyes made him pause. There was no mischief there. No desire for attention. It wasn't a game. The boy was looking at the piano the way a starving man might look at a loaf of bread. It was a look of pure, unadulterated need. And in that moment, Elias felt something shift inside him, a tiny crack in the thick wall of his professionalism. He was tired. So incredibly tired of being perfect, of being a machine. He thought of his own childhood, of the hours he had spent staring at pianos, longing to touch them before he was ever allowed a lesson. He saw a ghost of his younger self in this small, determined boy, against his better judgment, against every instinct that screamed at him to maintain control. He did something he had never done before. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug and gestured towards the bench with one elegant hand. "1 minute," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He expected a disaster. He expected a cacophony of random, banging notes that would make everyone cringe. He was already preparing to stand up and gently but firmly remove the child. He was doing it out of a moment of strange, weary curiosity, a lapse in his professional guard. The mother's mouth fell open. The boy's face, however, broke into a small, radiant smile. He let go of his mother's hand and scrambled onto the bench. It was a struggle. The bench was high and smooth, and his short legs dangled in the air, far from the floor. He had to wiggle and push with his hands to get into a position where he could reach the keys. The lobby was completely silent now. Everyone was watching, their expressions a mixture of amusement, curiosity, and second-hand embarrassment for the mother. Elias stood up, taking a step back, his arms crossed over his chest. He was the picture of a patient adult indulging a child's whim, but his mind was racing. This was a mistake. A terrible, unprofessional mistake. The boy finally settled himself on the bench. He wriggled forward until his tummy was pressed against the edge of the piano. His small hands, which looked tiny and pale next to the white and black keys, hovered over them for a moment. He wasn't looking at the sheet music, which was still on the stand. He wasn't looking at the audience. He was just looking at the keys, as if he was having a silent conversation with them. Elias braced himself. He was ready for the noise, for the chaos, for the inevitable crying of the boy when he was told to stop. He took a deep breath, ready to step in and end this little experiment and reclaim his piano. But then the boy's small fingers descended, and the sound that came out was not chaos at all. The man at the piano, Elias, stood with his arms crossed, a statue of professional patience. He was ready for it. He was ready for the jarring, discordant crash of a child's hand smacking down on the keys. He was ready for the giggles from the crowd, the mother's frantic apology. The awkward moment when he would have to step in and gently but firmly remove the boy from the bench. He had already mentally composed the polite, slightly weary smile he would give the audience as he resumed his rightful place. It was a small, unfortunate interruption in a long and predictable day. But the sound that came out was not a crash. It was not a bang. It was a single, clear note. It was a C, played in the middle of the keyboard. It was not struck hard or soft, but with a kind of careful curiosity, as if the boy was testing the temperature of water. The note rang out, pure and clean, and then slowly faded into the silence of the lobby. A few people shifted in their seats, confused. Elias's eyebrow twitched. That was unexpected, then. The boy's small hand moved again. A few more notes followed. Not a familiar tune, but a simple, questioning little phrase. It was like a child's first words, hesitant but full of meaning. The notes were spaced far apart, each one given time to breathe and be heard. There was no rhythm, not in the way Elias understood it. It was a rhythm of feeling, of thought. The boy Sam seemed to be listening to each note, as if the piano was talking back to him, and he was responding. His head was cocked to one side, the same way it had been when he was watching from behind the fern. He was completely lost in his own small world, a world that now included the entire spellbound room. Elias felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't annoyance anymore. It was confusion. This was not the random mashing of keys he had expected. There was an intention here, a quiet purpose. He watched the boy's hands. They were small and chubby, the fingers not yet long and agile, but they moved with a strange certainty. He wasn't looking at his hands. He was looking at the strings inside the piano, his expression one of deep concentration, as if he could see the music as it was being born. The simple melody began to grow. It started to take on a shape, a feeling, and as it did, a cold chill ran down Elias's spine. The melody was sad. It was profoundly, heartbreakingly sad. It was the same feeling he had tried to convey with the complex, difficult sonata he had just played. But this was different. His sadness had been a painting, a perfect, technically brilliant reproduction of an emotion. This boy's music was the real thing. It was the raw, unfiltered ache of loneliness. It was the sound of a single tear rolling down a cheek. It was the feeling of being small in a very big world, of wanting something you can't have. The lobby had transformed. The amused smiles were gone. The businessman had put his phone away, his mouth slightly agape. The young couple were no longer whispering to each other, but were staring at the little boy, their hands clasped tightly together. The mother, who had been a statue of embarrassment, now stood with her hands over her mouth, her eyes shining with tears she didn't understand. The entire room had been pulled into the boy's quiet, sad world. The air grew thick with an emotion that was so real, so tangible, it was almost hard to breathe. And for Elias, the world was crumbling. He, the master, the virtuoso, was listening to a lesson in emotion from a 7-year-old. He had spent a lifetime learning to build walls around his feelings, to channel them into perfect, controlled, safe patterns of notes. He had learned to be brilliant, but in doing so, he had forgotten how to be real. And here was this small boy, with no training, no knowledge of music theory, playing with more honesty and truth in a few simple notes than Elias had in a whole career. The boy wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't thinking about technique or what the critics would say. He was just feeling. And the piano was his voice. The melody shifted slightly. It was still sad, but now there was something else in it. A tiny spark of hope. A note of wonder. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long rain. It was the feeling of finding a pretty stone on a beach or seeing a rainbow for the first time. It was the simple, pure joy of being alive, even amidst the sadness. This was the part that truly broke Elias. He had forgotten how to do that. He had forgotten that sadness and joy could live in the same song, in the same heart. He had become a one-trick pony, a master of a single, polished, and ultimately empty performance. He could feel his own heart beating in his chest, a heavy, painful thud. His breath was caught in his throat. He felt a stinging behind his eyes, a hot, unfamiliar pressure. He hadn't cried in years. He had trained himself not to. But now, standing in the middle of a hotel lobby, listening to a little boy play a simple, made-up song, he felt the tears welling up. He was speechless. Not just because the music was beautiful, but because it was a mirror. It was showing him everything he had lost, everything he had given up in his pursuit of perfection. It was the ghost of his own childhood, the ghost of the boy he used to be, the boy who used to play for the sheer joy of it. Before music became a job, a burden, a cage, the boy played one last lingering note. It hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering question mark. And then silence. A deep, profound silence that was so much more than the absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the weight of the emotion that had just been poured into the room. No one moved. No one spoke. No one clapped. To clap would have been like shouting in a cathedral. It would have been a violation of the sacred moment. Sam slid off the bench, his sneakers squeaking softly on the floor. He looked up at his mother, his face clear and innocent, as if he had done nothing more remarkable than tying his shoe. He took her hand. The spell was broken. The room seemed to take a collective, shuddering breath. And then a wave of applause began. Not the polite pattering rain from before, but a deep, thunderous, heartfelt roar. It was an eruption of gratitude, of release, of pure, unadulterated awe. But Elias didn't hear it. He was still standing there, frozen, his arms crossed, his face a mask of shock. He looked at his own hands, the hands that could play Chopin with flawless precision. And for the first time in his life, he felt like they were useless. The little boy had just done something with a few simple notes that he, with all his talent and all his fame, could no longer do. He had spoken the truth, and Elias was left utterly, completely, and terrifyingly speechless. The sound that finally broke the spell was not a note from the piano, but the soft, apologetic voice of the little boy's mother. The lobby was still trapped in the heavy, sacred silence that followed the last hanging note. People were holding their breath, afraid to shatter the moment. But the mother, her face a mixture of tears and confusion, gently tugged on her son's hand. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "Let's go." The boy, Sam, slid off the bench without a word. He seemed to wake from a dream, his eyes clearing as he looked at his mother. He took her hand, his small fingers disappearing into hers. He gave the piano one last backward glance, a simple, curious look, and then he allowed himself to be led away. They disappeared into the crowd, just two people leaving a hotel lobby, as if nothing had happened. Their departure was like a signal. The dam of silence broke, and a sound erupted from the people gathered there. It was not the polite, pattering rain of applause from before. It was a deep, thunderous, emotional roar. It was a wave of sound that filled the entire space, a sound of awe, of gratitude, of pure, overwhelming feeling. People were on their feet. The businessman was clapping with a force that made his whole body shake. The young couple were holding each other, tears streaming down their faces. It was the kind of applause usually reserved for a legend at the end of a career-defining performance. A sound that said, "We will never forget this as long as we live." But the man it was meant for, Elias, did not hear it. He was standing frozen by the piano, his arms still crossed, his face a mask of shock. The sound of the crowd was a distant, muffled roar, like ocean waves heard from far away. He was trapped inside a different sound, the echo of the simple, haunting melody the boy had played. It was looping in his head over and over, each note a question, each phrase a truth he was no longer able to ignore. He felt a strange detachment from his own body, as if he was watching himself from a corner of the room. He saw the famous pianist, the man in the expensive suit, standing stiffly, looking lost, and he felt a profound pity for him. Slowly, as if moving through thick water, Elias lowered his arms. His gaze fell upon his own hands. For 60 years, these hands had been his identity. They were his pride, his tools, his weapons. They were hands that could tame the most ferocious passages of Liszt, that could coax the delicate poetry from Debussy. They were famous, celebrated hands. But now, as he looked at them, they felt like foreign objects. They were just long-fingered things with prominent knuckles and neatly trimmed nails. They were the hands of a technician, a skilled mechanic who knew how to operate a beautiful machine. They were not the hands of a musician. Not anymore. The boy's hands, small and clumsy, had done something with a few notes that his hands, with all their training and discipline, could not. They had spoken from the heart. His hands only knew how to recite from a script. His eyes drifted from his hands to the piano. For so many years, it had been an extension of his ego, a platform for his brilliance. It was a beautiful but soulless instrument that he had conquered. He had bent it to his will, forcing it to obey his commands of perfect tempo and flawless dynamics. But as he looked at it now, he saw it differently. He saw it not as a machine, but as a living thing. It was a wooden box full of wires and hammers that had just shared a secret with a child. It had a soul, and for a few minutes, it had chosen to let that soul be heard by someone pure enough to understand. He felt a sudden, sharp sense of shame. For all the years he had used it without ever truly listening to it, the crowd's applause began to soften slightly. People sensing that something was wrong, that the man they were celebrating was not with them. They started to sit down, a confused murmur replacing the thunderous cheers. Elias finally moved. He did not bow. He did not acknowledge them. He slowly, carefully sat back down on the bench. The leather felt cool and familiar under him, but everything else had changed. He looked at the sheet music on the stand. It was the score for his final piece, a dazzling, virtuosic showpiece that was guaranteed to bring the house down. It was the perfect ending. A perfect hollow lie. He could not play it. To play those notes now would be an insult. It would be like shouting after a moment of quiet prayer. It would be a betrayal of the truth he had just been forced to witness. He closed his eyes. He saw the boy's face, the intense concentration, the innocent earnestness. He heard the simple, sad melody in his head, and the little spark of hope that followed it. The boy hadn't been trying to be a prodigy. He hadn't been trying to impress anyone. He had just been trying to share a feeling. He had a conversation with the piano, and for a few minutes, he had let everyone else listen in, with a hand that was trembling slightly. Elias reached out and gently closed the sheet music. He pushed it to the side. The small crowd watched, holding their breath again. What was he doing? He placed his hands on the keys, his fingers feeling strange and uncertain. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first real breath he had taken all afternoon. And then he began to play. It was not the scheduled piece. It was not a known classical piece. It was something new, something he was making up right there in that moment. The music was simple, much simpler than anything he had played in public for decades. It was a quiet, hesitant melody, like someone learning to speak again. It was full of spaces, full of silence. But in that silence, there was so much feeling. It was his response to the boy. It was his side of the conversation. It was a song of apology, to the piano, to the audience, and to himself. It was a song of gratitude. It was a song of rediscovery as he played. The tension in his shoulders began to melt away. The stiffness in his back disappeared. He was no longer the performer on display. He was just a man, sitting at a piano, finally telling the truth. The music was not perfect. There were a few hesitant notes, a slightly rough transition, but it was more alive, more full of passion and humanity than anything he had ever played. It was the sound of a man finding his way back home, one simple note at a time. The lobby was utterly silent. No one clapped. No one moved. They just listened, sharing in a moment that was not a performance, but a quiet, beautiful miracle. And for the first time in a very long time, as his fingers found the next note, Elias Thorne, the famous pianist, felt like a musician again.